What's going on, folks, and welcome back to the waiting line of Eternum. I know we recently just had our 4th delay announcement, but since they also ended up wiping the forms, I figured I'd keep up the tradition of covering the patch notes and discuss what was included in the initial beta patch notes and what happened in the 2 weeks after. So it first starts off with the world experience portion of the patch notes. Here's where we have an increased iron node count and polished high-tier material distribution across all zones to create better resource runs. Something, of course, that was a good idea to tweak, and I do believe they might be expanding on this in the future, potentially right before launch. One thing that was noticed is that during the beta, there were players that disliked how many materials specifically tied to cooking were still locked to the provision chest. But to my surprise, and this is something I hope they continue to do, they've at least started to add more produce spawns, even going so far as to add the infamous cow milking feature that players have requested. So it stands to reason that we might see more nodes in the future, maybe ones that can be tied directly to resources like salt, for example. Next interesting thing to take note of is that the expedition faction missions no longer require completion of the expedition. Beforehand, there were some issues on the higher level side of faction missions, where sometimes you notice your entire top bar filled with expedition related objectives, which became a problem with the limited amount of ways of getting the keys past the quest lines. I still prefer the old version of the faction missions, but at least this time around, compared to previous iterations, it went okay. Next thing is some newly added lore notes to First Light, Everfall, Windsward, and Monarch's Bluff. Saw a couple of these already, like the King Arthur stories, but I'm still intending to go back and collect the rest. Then we've got ourselves the AI changes. For general AI, the first one is that they reduced the leash distance for most creatures from 100 meters to 70 meters, which is cool, but the only mobs that I wish they would reduce that further on is the wolves or maybe the ghosts, both of which are normally the bane of my existence when I'm running down the roads. But they did add that most AI will have a shorter aggro range for players 10 levels higher than them. That's a really nice change to complement the opposite change they made a while back, where if you're a certain level lower than the mob, they'll have increased perception and aggro radius. It is stated though that this change does not apply to enemies in invasions or expeditions. Next, we have a few changes related to the brutes and dryad beasts. This creature class refers to the ogre variants, as I like to call them, the creatures known as Banes, Morzul the Herald, corrupted ogres, I believe the siren's brute is also included in this, etc. It turns out that they made it where they no longer cause stagger on their light swipes. Instead, they've increased their base health by about 15%, and several of these brute type enemies have had their basic melee damage increased by 50%. For bears, they've also done a similar change where their light swipes no longer cause stagger either, and their base health was additionally increased by 15% as well. Skipping down, and we have a change for the corrupted entities. They've reduced the rate of attack on their high level variants, along with making it where their running flurry attack only has grit and causes stagger only during the final hit of the attack. For those unaware, these are one of the various different corrupted enemies you'll come across at endgame. The reason I love this change is because in addition to the flurry attack plus the pull move that they're capable of doing, everything about them makes them one of the most collectively annoying and powerful enemies you'll come across when you reach max level. Moving over to the expeditions, we have ourselves some changes, starting first with the Lazarus expedition. For Scylla, the first major boss of Lazarus, we've got some health increases, damage, and increases to the effectiveness of her passives and skills. Same thing for Chartis, increases to his base health, the damage of his rolling hands, swipe damage, punch damage, reduction to his I-beam damage thankfully, and more. We also have a long list for Garden of Genesis, Starstone Barrow, and Dynasty Shipyard, with the majority of the changes being tied to the Blighted Greenskeeper, Electos the Relentless, and Isabella herself. I'll leave this all here so you get a chance to look at that. And then we come to the rest of the combat related changes. They've increased the distance covered by normal and heavy dodging. We now enter an exhausted state when we reach 0 stamina, which mainly means that when they break our block, or we dodge too much or throw too many hatchets, our stamina bar turns gray and we can no longer dodge, block, or use those hatchet throws until it regenerates. We also have a fix for not being able to use auto run while carrying the Arcane Barrier in Starstone Barrow, or even the Purifying Flame in Garden of Genesis. Which then brings us to the jump changes, where we have a couple minor ones that also include being able to jump in place. This is something that I didn't expect to see during the beta, let alone being added to the game for a while because it's such a random change. But it is one that some people had asked for during the preview alongside swimming, so hopefully some people are having a lot of fun with that. We then come to the PvP damage scaling changes, which did drum up some controversy during the beta phase. Because of all the feedback, this may or may not be getting a tweak before the actual launch. It's crucial to keep in mind that these changes were made just before the beta started, and during the majority or entirety of it, there was a humongous split in the community on this PvP scaling system. Potentially almost or just as much as the lack of old stagger system had caused too. I did end up noticing a lot of mixed feedback on that as well. But following that, we did get a change for sheathing and unsheathing your weapons too. We can now do this without slowing down, and during the beta there were some techniques forming where people would dodge and incorporate weapon sheathing in between them to create a bit of animation cancel. We then come to the status effects, where they've created a cap on what percentages you could get to with various buffs and debuffs to prevent super stacking. With Ren, this is capped at 30% at a time, Fortify it's 50%, Haste, Slow, Empower, Weaken, and Disease all 50% as well, but the Haste Elixir from the Siege Armory vendor does ignore this cap. We then come to a few movement changes where they've added some quality of life options and features when it comes to parkour. We then come down to the weapon changes. It starts off with them fixing an issue where we couldn't use abilities to cancel life and fire staff basic attacks, but we also have one where you could cancel various bow, musket, and life staff abilities prematurely with basic attacks. That one's been fixed. Then scrolling down to the shield changes, they've adjusted shields so that each type has an advantage or disadvantage. Round shields will always have more damage stats, more block stamina damage, and stagger damage to AI than kite shields, but have less block stability. But for the block stability, that's related to how fast your stamina depletes when you're blocking. For the kite shields, they're normally in the middle on this, but for the tower shields, those will do less damage, block stamina damage, and stagger damage, but they will have the most block stability, which is really good if you plan on being a tank. Then we have our next weapons, starting with the fire staff that has had several different adjustments, most notably for Burnout and the Meteor. Burnout is the spell, or used to be, where you would dash forward leaving a trail of fire behind you. The changes they made to it in this patch make it a lot more viable in pretty much all situations. So much so, in fact, that people were actively using it in PvP. Rapier Firestaff ended up becoming a pretty popular combo partly because of that reason. The second big change was related to meteors. Due to how unstable the meteors were causing the territory wars in the testing phase to be, they decided to change the way the meteor spell functions. It's now a spell that triggers an initial impact and then becomes an AoE dot spell that might still get tweaked in the future because of various feedback they were getting about the spell during beta. Moving on to the Great Axe, we have an increased base damage of 78 to 82. We've also got an adjustment to the Reap skill's initial hitbox to be wider so it consistently matches the target you're trying to hit. Now during beta, we did notice that the Great Axe had an issue going on that was known as the cleave, where if you executed a basic attack and then followed up with the heavy right after, but you had the heavy pull passive, people were noticing that you would be getting hit twice instead of just once from this attack. The Great Axe overall was pretty powerful during this beta phase and is more than likely going to be one of the main ones getting a tweak. Gravity Well also had its pull extended from 10% to 30%, and luckily this skill was working really well during the beta, at least in PvP. It was so good to see actually, because for so long it felt like the skill needed a big touch up, but after the rest of these minor changes, we come to the Hatchet. Hatchet has got a few changes, all pertaining to one skill known as Berserk. First thing is that it'll no longer trigger a sprint delay. We also have a change where they removed an unintentional damage reduction that was being applied to the uninterruptible Berserk upgrade. And then we got the biggest part of this one. They removed the stun immunity from uninterruptible Berserk to be more consistent with other crowd control status effects. So now the upgrade only applies to attack reactions, which from what I was told is talking mainly about when you initially get CC'd. That's when you can break out of it with Berserk, but not after. Might need some clarification on that, and they may retweak it when launch does arrive, because Berserk has always been one that's been known for getting these tweaks. We then have the Ice Gauntlet with two minor changes, with the first being an added 1-second route when entering the Ice Shower, and then the infamous Life Staff. So during this patch, they increased the light attack damage from 100% to 107, increased the heavy attack damage from 140% to 151, fixed an issue that could cause the player to get stuck in the casting animation when using Sacred Ground, limited the max range of Splash of Light to 100 meters to make sure it doesn't get used in an exploitable way, and updated the Desperate Speed passive to have a 5-second timer on trigger to prevent the stacking of healing cooldown reduction. The Life Staff has been branded as incredibly powerful during the beta phase when combined with a secondary weapon utilizing the Ember Gem and a primary or secondary focus build. They got a lot of feedback on this, and I'm pretty positive that there's going to be some changes due for this one before we hit launch. Then we have the Musket that's gone through some pretty extensive balance changes, and just recently before the beta was in a state of absolute power. Like the kind of power capable of 3-shotting somebody in heavy armor full con build situation. It was pretty nasty. But the first thing they did is remove the stagger from the musket gun butt when ammo is depleted, but gave it a bit of pushback so that you can swap weapons easily when the ammo runs out. We also have a reduction in crit damage, changes to the ultimate passives across both trees, and various different changes to the passives on both sides. And then, lastly, we've got the sword and shield and the warhammer. So for sword, they fixed an issue where shield rush and shield bash were not hitting consistently. We then have the third attack and the light attack chain starting 4 frames faster now, which I absolutely felt and loved during the entirety of the beta. And I'm sure other sword users can agree, but the final attack in that chain felt super smooth this time around. We then have some changes to the warhammer. For the first one, they increased the base damage from 82 to 84, changed up multiple different parts of the skills like the rend on the armor breaker, duration of the shockwave, which is good for crowd control, weapon damage and ultimate damage on mighty gavel, and a few others. After these changes, we come to the next section, starting it off with a minor perk change related to the chain elements. So during the beta, you probably came across different weapons that included perks like Chain Lightning, Chain Fire, Chain Void, and these weapons are supposed to generate a beam related to that element that bounces between targets near you for some AoE. Turns out that before beta there was an issue with this, but now they've gone ahead and fixed that for release. For the economy changes, it starts with the decrease in the cost of activating territory lifestyle buffs, and those are the buffs you can get as a resident of the territory once the town projects are complete. They've also decreased the territory upkeep cost, increased the gold bonuses for level 60 to 65 minor and major corrupted breaches, made a couple changes to the amount of gold players can earn in different game mode activities, and skipping down, they even increased the initial cost of claiming a territory from 10k to 100k, which was very surprising to see. This is something that we came across very quickly during the beta, but it did make sense to do because 10k realistically you could pull together in the span of 30 minutes for your guild. Granted, 100k may not take very long either, maybe a couple of days depending on the guild donations and faction donations, but at least it does make claiming territories more of a challenge. For the progression changes, they reviewed their XP curves for refining, crafting, and gathering trait skills and made several changes across the board related to these subjects. As you can see, they've increased the amount of XP gained for refining an item, cutting gemstones, crafting an item, gathering an item, and they changed the regular leveling speed from 7 to 12, increasing the speed by 15%, increasing the speed from 12 to 25 by 10%, and decreasing the leveling speed from 50 to 60 by 10% as well. They also added a 5% flagging bonus when you're marked for PvP, but even though it says that a number of main story quest lines have been added, as we saw during the beta, the main story still seems to end around the Depths expedition. But that doesn't mean that before launch they won't add the rest of it. And for the rewards portion, they noticed that many gem slots rolling on lower tier gear were going unsocketed because players swap out their equipment very frequently early in the game. So what they did is changed up the roll order. Previously, items rolled attributes, a gem slot, and up to 3 perks in that order. But now, they roll attributes, a perk, a gem slot, and up to 2 other perks. They also adjusted breach caches for completing the highest level major breaches. These breaches are more likely to drop named items and increase a player's high watermark for their equipment. And the watermark is like your overall gear score. And the higher it is, the higher the equipment should be that you get from drops and chests. We also have an increased chance of getting an upgrade from arena chests according to these notes, and they adjusted the loot drop modifiers for targets tagged by multiple players and parties of players. Now what happens is that the more people that tag an enemy, the lower its likelihood to drop loot, down to a non-zero minimum. This actually does explain why we didn't really get that good of loot when we went field boss hunting. I wanted to talk more about this during this video because I don't think these types of changes are the right way to go, but I think I'll save that for a more in-depth video in the future. And we started a poll on this, so I want to wait and see because I'm really curious to see what people feel about the subject. Now past that, we've got the second portion of this section. This is where they talk about some more minor changes like adjusting the drop rate of ammo versus refining regents, reducing the furniture drops we get from containers in the open world, rebalance the amount of materials required for the armament work orders, as well as other ones to better align with XP gains. And we'll be talking about those in a bit too, but we also have some changes to the equipment visuals. One of the things talked about in previous feedback is how there weren't really enough feminine apparel styles at lower level. So things like boots and gloves, dresses, fascinators, and leggings. So more of these were added to the game. They also updated the visuals on weapons found in Starstone Barrows, tweaked the territory war weapons we get, as well as updated the ones we usually get from the Drowned. And then for the crafting section, they changed up the way that we actually get these recipes. For cooking, now a function similar to furnishing ware, we have to find some of these recipes inside of containers. They also talk about artifact weapons and armor, such as Voidbent armor, which is something we've dived into before, and now these are guaranteed to roll gear score 600, but they require the player to be a master in their respective craft. And unlike schematics and recipes, artifacts are rare drops from the open world and expedition content. That can enable a one-time use crafting recipe for creating powerful items. Now the artifact itself is in fact tradable, but the item created becomes bind on equip. So this generates a market and promotes trading so that crafters are able to fashion some of the best items in the game. I kinda wish we had that for Expedition Key Stonecutter materials too, but this will at least do for now. Skipping down, they've increased the stack size of potions and utility items up to 100 starting from 10. And armor perks that give gathering trade skill luck have been increased. And gems from silver, gold, platinum, and or a calcum now roll 1 to 3 of one gem when you mine it, instead of 3 rolls of 1 gem each. Gem Fusion now upgrades the tier of the gem to a raw gem, and in addition to the previous resource node change we went over in the beginning, they reduced the respawn on iron veins by 30% and increased the ore yield by 20%. And skipping down a line, they've added a number of iron nodes to the world to increase the iron supply. And during the beta, it wasn't impossible to find iron per se, but I did notice that if 2 people, let alone 1, were in the same area running it back to back, it became much harder trying to find nodes that hadn't been touched yet. The next thing, they did increase the rawhide yield from elk and bison, added the ability for elite predators to drop additional rawhide, and adjusted non-artifact master level armor styles like Furlined, Beast Hunter, and Shadewalker to function like other procedural sets of armor. Then moving on past all these crafting changes, we've got the UX and UI stuff. So they made several improvements to fishing, starting with how we can chat while fishing, thank goodness, and a couple other minor changes, which brings us down to the portion where they confirm that the Streamer Spotlight and Twitch Sub-Army feature are upcoming, but they weren't available just yet during the beta. And for the last section, we have Polish. Starting with a really cool screenshot showcasing how we're able to see the crafting and refining station levels on any settlement via the map. And this will be super useful so people don't have to wonder which town has the most upgraded bench they're looking for. We also had a compass change where now the HUD highlights if you're in a location with an active objective. We've also got some map panel polish for settlements and spirit shrines. They added some weapon icons to the attribute screen, and a few other minor ones to finish off the rest of the notes. And that's all for the beta patch, but we did have multiple downtimes where they produced some hot fixes, and we can talk about that now. So the major one to discuss was when they temporarily reduced the experience gain on territory town projects. You see, there was an exploit during the beta where people were stacking up town projects, specifically the armament ones we talked about earlier was the most popular, and people were able to cash out all the materials they gathered for a crap ton of experience in exchange. This allowed people to skyrocket in levels, and more than likely you'll see this get tweaked in the future, but after that patch it seems like things settled down. So hopefully we won't see anything like that, or the fact that you were also able to reset these town projects by logging out for about 5 minutes and logging back in. But that was also patched on the July 30th patch, so we should be good there. But with that, that's everything to talk about for the beta patch notes, and as always, thank you very much for watching and have a wonderful night or day. Farewell.